questions if you would like. Question 1. Assume the country of Alpha has a balanced budget. If the government and central bank of Alpha implement expansionary fiscal and monetary policies in order to address a recession, what effect would these policies have in the short run on the government budget and interest rate? So we've got two columns, government budget and interest rates. Choice A, the government budget moves toward deficit, interest rates increase. B, the budget moves towards deficit, interest rates are indeterminate. C, the government budget remains in balance and interest rates decrease. D, the budget moves towards surplus, interest rates decrease. Or E, the budget moves towards surplus and interest rates are indeterminate. So let's go back to the government of Alpha. The government has a balanced budget, and the government and the central bank want to implement two policies. They're both expansionary, but we've got expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policies, both to address a recession. So let's take them one by one and look at what effect expansionary fiscal policy will have on the budget and interest rates, what effect expansionary monetary policy will have on the government budget and interest rates, and then look back at our choices. So in order to address a recession, remember that both policies are trying to increase aggregate demand. So when the government of Alpha is thinking about expansionary fiscal policy, they really have two choices: cut taxes or increase its spending. Both of those things will increase the deficit. So when we're thinking about the government's budget, we're really deciding, will the deficit increase, will the surplus increase, or will the budget remain balanced? Expansionary fiscal policy will involve cutting taxes, which will reduce revenue, or increasing spending, which will increase the outlays that the government is taking part of. So the deficit will for sure increase. Now, as far as the interest rate, we need to remember that when the government runs a deficit, the government must borrow. And when the government borrows, we can think about the loanable funds market here. The government demands loans, or you could say that the supply of loanable funds decreases. But either way, in that market, we see that this fiscal policy will increase interest rates. So back to our columns. Expansionary fiscal policy, increased deficit, and then interest rates will increase. But remember, Alpha is also conducting monetary policy. So expansionary monetary policy has to do with the central bank of Alpha and their use of interest rates. This has no impact on the deficit. The government is not spending more money here or cutting taxes. It just has to do with interest rates. But interest rates will definitely decrease. That's the whole point of this policy, is to increase aggregate demand. So interest rates will need to fall in order to increase consumption and investment. So to summarize, deficit will increase and then no impact on the deficit for our two policies. So we know for sure that the government budget will move toward deficit. Now, here's what I love about column questions. If I look at the first column, the government budget, I'm just down to choice A and B because those are the choices that have moved toward deficit. And then because expansionary fiscal policy increases interest rates and expansionary monetary policy decreases interest rates, we really don't know what the overall impact on interest rates will be. We don't know which effect will be larger. So interest rates are indeterminate, which leaves us with choice B. The government budget will move toward deficit and interest rates will be indeterminate.
SJBC specializes in training that gets you career ready. Train to be an air.
Question 2. Assume the economy is initially in long-run equilibrium. Which of the following describes how the short-run effect of an increase in personal income taxes would be depicted in the Phillips curve model provided? So the model that's provided shows the inflation rate on the y-axis, the unemployment rate on the x-axis. I see a vertical long-run Phillips curve, and then 3 downward-sloping short-run Phillips curves, and then various points A through E. Let's look at our choices. Choice A, a movement along SRPC1 from point A to point B. So that's down a short-run Phillips curve toward a higher unemployment rate and a lower inflation rate. B, a movement along SRPC2 from point C to D. That's up an existing short-run Phillips curve to a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate. C, a movement along the long-run Phillips curve from point C to E. This is a lower inflation rate but a constant unemployment rate. A shift from SRPC2 to SRPC3. This is a shift of the entire short-run Phillips curve inward. And then choice E is a shift from SRPC3 to SRPC2, which is a shift outward from one Phillips curve to the next. So let's go back to the event that happens there, where we need to look at what happens on the Phillips curve. Here we have an increase in personal income taxes. So what I'd like to do with a Phillips curve question is to first think about how will this event affect the entire economy using the aggregate supply and demand model, and then look at, okay, how are we going to show that on the Phillips curve? There will be an increase in income taxes, a decrease in disposable income, so people just have less money to spend. This will lead to a decrease in consumption, and if we we show that, if we shift aggregate demand to the left, we'll see on the y-axis a lower price level and then a lower level of output on the x-axis, a lower GDP. That must mean that there is higher unemployment because there's fewer resources that are being used because of the lower output. So on the Phillips curve, we know that there's going to be lower inflation and higher unemployment. So the only way that we can show that with our choices is a movement from A to B, and that is going to be choice A, a movement along SRPC1 from point A to point B. Question 3. Country A's growth rate in per capita real gross domestic product, GDP, has been consistently higher than that of country B. Which of the following factors can account for these differences in the per capita GDP growth rates? So before I look at the choices, let's just talk about what we mean by per capita real gross domestic product. So per capita means per person. Real gross domestic product is real GDP, real output, divided by the population. This is the best measure of a country's standard of living that we have. So we know, based on this question, that country A has a higher standard of living, probably because they're more productive. They produce more goods and services per person than country B. So let's look at our choices and go through them one by one. Choice A, country B's government gives more investment tax credits. So this means that the government of country B would be giving tax benefits to firms to conduct investment spending. Well, that certainly couldn't explain that country A's growth rate is higher or that country A is more productive. So choice A cannot be true. B, the labor force of country A is becoming more skilled than the labor force of country B. Now this sounds good. Country A has a more skilled labor force. This means that their workers are probably more productive. They're able to produce more output with the same inputs. So I like B so far. Choice C, the natural rate of unemployment is higher in country A. Recall that the natural rate of unemployment is structural and frictional unemployment. So this choice is saying that there are more people out of work in country A than in country B. This could not explain country A's higher real GDP. I don't like that one. D, country A's central bank is less effective at controlling the inflation rate. They're less effective at controlling the inflation rate. This means higher inflation, perhaps more unpredictable inflation. This would not be conducive to creating a higher real per capita GDP in country A. And choice E, although the populations of countries A and B are the same, country A has twice as many people who are retired. Again, this is very similar to choice C, where if we have more people who are retired in country A, we have more people who are out of work in country A. So this cannot be true either. So going back to B, the labor force in country A is more skilled. Yes, that can explain higher real GDP per capita in country A. So choice B is our answer. Question 4. Assume that Canadian consumers increase their demand for Mexican financial assets. How would the supply of Canadian dollars, the value of the Mexican peso relative to the Canadian dollar, and Canadian net exports to Mexico change? So we're dealing with two countries. This is a foreign exchange question, Canada and Mexico. And we're told that Canadian consumers would like to buy Mexican financial assets, so perhaps stocks, bonds. And we know that anything that is purchased from a country, Canada purchasing financial assets from Mexico, means that they need Mexico's currency. These Canadians need Mexican pesos. So let's look at the 3 columns that were given. And before we look at the choices, let's just think through how each of these variables will change based on the increase in demand for Mexican pesos. The first column asks for supply of Canadian dollars. So Canadians would like to buy assets from Mexico. They demand pesos. And in order to demand pesos in the foreign exchange market, Canadians must supply their currency. So Canadians must supply Canadian dollars. That will increase the supply of Canadian dollars. So the supply of Canadian dollars will increase. That's what we're looking for. Okay, now the value of the peso. I like to use a foreign exchange graph when I'm asked about the value of a currency, because that helps me visualize what is happening to the currency. Now we're asked about the peso, and we've already said that Canadians will demand more pesos. So I'm going to sketch a graph. This is just for my benefit of the market for pesos. And then I've shown an increase, a shift to the right of the demand for pesos. And then I can see on the y-axis an increase in the exchange rate. So this means that the peso has appreciated. And then we'll need this in the next column, but because the peso has appreciated, the Canadian dollar has depreciated. The last column is about Canadian net exports. So this is, if we recall, net exports, exports minus imports. So this is asking us about the goods and services that Canada is selling to other countries, Mexico, and then the Mexican goods and services that Canada is importing. So if the peso has appreciated and the Canadian dollar has depreciated, it means, first of all, that because the peso has appreciated, anything that Canadians buy from Mexico is now relatively more expensive. It will be more expensive for Canadians to buy anything from Mexico. Because the Canadian dollar has depreciated, anything that is purchased from Canada, so anything purchased by Mexicans from Canada, will now be relatively cheaper. So because imports will decrease, exports will increase, that means that Canadian net exports will increase. So our three columns, the supply of Canadian dollars will increase, the value of the peso will increase or appreciate, and Canadian net exports will increase. So let's look at our choices and find the correct column at our choices for appreciate and Canadian net exports will increase. So let's look at our choices and find the correct column. And we are going to be looking at choice A. The supply of Canadian dollars will increase, the value of the peso will increase, and Canadian net exports will increase. Thank you. That's all for today's video.